So far we've been looking at the standard web parts that we've been working with in the last couple of demonstrations. And so now we're going to take a look at the visual web parts. In Visual Studio 2012 we have both the project and item templates for visual web parts. And I have to say that this is a pretty huge improvement from Visual Studio 2010. So in Visual Studio 2010 the visual web part was first introduced. So prior to that, you could use a user control and you could have a web part just load the user control, and then but you would have to do all that work yourself. And then in Visual Studio 2010 it made it a little bit easier by you go to create a visual web part and it would create a web part class, and then in the class there would be some boiler code that would load up your user control. So you'd have your web part file, your web part class.cs file, and then you'd have the ACX file and the ACX.cs code behind file for your user control, and so all that would be together. And now in Visual Studio 2012 those are both merged together, so it's actually really easy. No longer uses the control templates folder, so the compiler actually lets you use the user control, and you get the great design time experience of being able to put in static HTML if you want. And then when the compiler compiles it, it looks as if it's just a regular web part to SharePoint. And SharePoint treats it just like a regular non-visual web part. By doing this, it actually really simplifies development. When I say that, I mean before, when you wanted to, for example, in Visual Studio 2010, it was still pretty good. You could actually, with the visual web part item template, you could go ahead and create your web part, and then you'd have your user control. And the web part's job was basically just to load the user control, but then also it would handle exposing any properties. So for properties that you wanted to persist in the SharePoint content database using personalization. But what you had to do was the web part would expose the properties to the SharePoint framework, and then the web part would have to forward those values on to your user control if you want to use them in the user control. Now you don't have to do that because everything is simplified. It's all in one. So if you put a property on your visual web part, you don't need to pass it anywhere else because you're right there. So it actually makes things a lot easier. So what we'll do now is we'll go take a look in Visual Studio 2012 and create a visual web part and deploy it to our site. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add an item to the project here for a visual web part. So click Add, New Item, come down to, it's at the top, Visual Web Part. We'll call it Visual Web Part 1. Add that. And notice how when I added that web part, in the olden days you'd have a web part file that was loading this .acx file. Now it's all in one. But there's some magic going on that the compiler does. So we have a global file here that you don't have to worry. You should never touch this, but this is auto-generated by Visual Studio. And this is our code behind for our visual web part. And then here's the design surface of the web part. So we can go into design view if we want. Go split view, source, just like a regular user control. So what I'm going to do here is I have some snippets I'm going to add here. I'm going to add a button. Just a simple button to the page here, and we'll call it button 1, and it's just going to say button on it. Close that. Now we'll go to code behind. I'm going to add a property to the web part. So let's just put the property up here. So this is a property called button text. So this is just a simple string property. We're going to give it the category of configuration, and it's going to say button text for the display, and then it's going to have a description that'll show up in the tooltip. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and whatever the user sets for this property, we're going to go ahead and set that for our button. So I have a snippet for that. We need to override the onRender event to do that. So we'll go ahead and do that, but we need to change this a little bit. So what we'll do is say if this dot button, actually string dot is null or empty, this dot button text. So if the user hasn't set the button text yet, we'll just go ahead and set it to be the default. So the default will just be what it's currently set in the UI. And then we're just going to override the text property of the button. Actually, we'll just say, call it button 1. So in the UI, the text is button. And we'll call it, well, so it should show up the first time we run this, it should show up as button 1. But then when we set the property, it should change. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. You can see it's really streamlined now. I don't have to pass these properties to another user control class and worry about going back and forth. I am directly in the Webpart, just like and you can actually notice that wait for that term, while we're waiting for that to render. Notice how this is inheriting from Webpart. Even though it's we have the design surface of a regular user control. So that's why this is actually exposed as a regular Webpart. We'll wait for the site to come up. And we'll clean up our page here. We'll get rid of this Webpart. And let's add our new Webpart. Our new Webpart is Visual Webpart 1. So you notice how it says button 1, and that's because in the code behind this button text property hasn't been initialized yet, so it's null. And so since it's null, we went ahead and set it to button 1. So now let's go into the page. We'll edit it. We'll edit the web part, and we'll look at the property for it. And it's under configuration, so here's our configuration. So since we set it to button 1, that got persisted. So we'll just change this to say click me. Click OK. And here you go. So now the beauty of this is we have a nice design surface. We have the best of both worlds here. We have the design surface of the user control, and then we also have the goodness of the web part, so we get to add things like properties and let those properties be persisted with the web part manager can persist those properties into the SharePoint content database. And we can even do things like editor web parts, because it's just, as far as SharePoint is concerned, this is just a regular web part, but as far as developers are concerned, this is a visual web part, which we get to do lots more interesting types of development with it. I always like using visual web parts because if I'm working with a designer, I can just take HTML that they give me and then put it right into my visual web part or user control. And then I can just add code behind it to automate or data bind to whatever I need to data bind to.